Hi, my name's Courtney and I'm here with another book in my series on Brothers Karamazov. So I'm just going to show you my edition of the book, well loved, well read. And this version was translated by Andrew McAndrew. It's just the edition I happen to have and fell in love with, so yeah. I've actually already done a video on this topic of reading Brothers Karamazov as a Western reader, and I wanted to expand upon that topic after having reread it. So I'm going to break this video up into different sections to hopefully help explain how our approach as 21st century Western readers to this text colors our interpretation of it, and how that can lead to some confusion and misunderstandings. So firstly, I'll be breaking down the influence that Brothers Karamazov had on Western philosophy, and why that philosophy can be disproved with something as seemingly simple as a kiss. Then I want to further explain how Brothers Karamazov explores the Russian notion of Sobernost. And lastly, I want to showcase how each of the brothers represent an aspect of Russian character at the time. These all seem rather disparate, but they make sense if I put them all together, so let's get into it. As readers, we should always be aware of our biases. What we bring to what we are reading. This is not always easy to do, as our cultural biases are ingrained into us. Brothers Karamazov is an excellent book to actually stop and examine the biases we are bringing to our reading and understanding. And Dostoevsky actually forces you to do that. As Western readers, we may be inclined to agree with a certain character, but when the narrative doesn't agree with him, we have to stop and wonder why things turned out so differently than we as Western readers expected. I realize this seems super vague at this point, and I apologize. I do think that you can probably guess which character I'm talking about, though, if you have read the novel. I'm going to further explore this throughout the essay. In this introductory section, I want to expound on the influence of Brothers Karamazov on the Western world, before going on to explain how Western readers may not be getting a full understanding of the text. So let's dive into some existentialism. One of the most iconic chapters in Brothers Karamazov is the chapter of the Grand Inquisitor. In this chapter, Jesus has come back to Earth during the Spanish Inquisition, when the Catholic Church was interrogating and torturing people to root out heresy and enemies of the Church. He gets captured by the Grand Inquisitor, who proceeds to explain why people won't follow Jesus, and how by eliminating choice and replacing Jesus' refusals of the temptations with accepting a deal with the devil, people are happier and more secure. In this chapter, we get to see the culmination of Ivan's beliefs, and how he came to the conclusion that since God doesn't exist, everything is permissible. Ivan uses logic and reasoning, particularly Western European logic and reasoning, to come to these conclusions. I think it's important here to take a break from Brothers Karamazov to further explain the relationship between Western Europe and logic. The tradition that ties these two together can be traced to the beginnings of the Christian Church. I'm not here to give the history of the Christian Church, but suffice it to say that even with Paul, the influence of Greek philosophy, and particularly Platonic logic, were evident. The Western Church became even more influenced by Greek science and philosophy, while the Eastern Church actually developed different approaches to the belief in God. It's actually interesting to note that prior to the capital E Enlightenment, it was unthinkable to not believe in God. But once the resurgence of Greek logic came about, some people began using logic and science to prove the existence of God, while this actually led to others using logic and science to prove that God did not exist. Along with Platonic logic also came Aristotle and his stress on the importance of individualism. Russia and the Eastern Orthodox Church had a different approach to belief that I will discuss a little later. I wanted here to stress the underlying force logic has in Western world and how that led to atheism. We see how Ivan uses logic to come to his conclusions, and are told that his influences were Western repeatedly. His greatest wish is to visit Europe and study philosophy there. It's then interesting to note how much influence Dostoevsky, and our particular interest here, how Brothers Karamazov specifically influenced Western philosophy. Brothers Karamazov was not only highly influential in Russia, but in Western Europe as well. It was particularly influential for French existentialists. We see that particularly through Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, both existentialists and atheists, and both who held the Brothers Karamazov in high esteem. An examination of this in a book club even led someone to comment that, heck, the Grand Inquisitor practically gave birth to the French existentialists. Sartre himself even said that Ivan's claim that all is permissible if God does not exist was the starting point of existentialism. He expanded upon Ivan's philosophy, himself arguing man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Without a God to define essence and purpose for man, man is thrown into the world without purpose and then must determine his existence, an existence that precedes essence. At first, man is nothing, only afterward will he be something, and he himself will have made what he will be. Camus, too, was fascinated with Dostoevsky, and in particular the character of Ivan. He actually directed a theatrical adaptation of the Brothers Karamazov and chose to play the role of Ivan himself. Ivan's logic and what Camus saw as Dostoevsky's philosophy of absurdity and existentialism appealed to Camus. And as Western readers, we too are inclined to agree with Ivan and see his logic and reasoning as, well, for a lack of a better word, logical and reasonable. But then we read further and see that Aloysia's response to Ivan's logic and reason is a kiss. It seems simply a callback to the story of the Grand Inquisitor where Jesus kisses his torturer. However, it means more if we look at the story from a Russian standpoint, and in particular from the perspective of Sobernost. It is through this perspective that we can come to understand how something as seemingly innocuous and innocent as a kiss is able to disprove all of Ivan's logic and reasoning. So what is Sobernost? It's not an easy term to explain, as it's more than just a word. It captures what it means to be Russian at a particular time and place. I'm going to do the typical grade school essay opener here and say Merriam-Webster defines Sobernost as spiritual harmony based on freedom and unity and love. Wikipedia tells us the term originated with Ivan Karevsky and Alexei Khomyakov to underline the need for cooperation between people at the expense of individualism on the basis that the opposing groups focus on what is common between them. A concise and condensed definition of Sobernost fails to capture the whole idea though, so perhaps a poem is better. Russia is a thing of which the intellect cannot conceive. Hers is no common yardstick. You measure her uniquely. In Russia you believe. This is by Fyodor Tyutchev. Sobernost is a strongly Russian ideal, and I believe that Dostoevsky weaved this Slavophilic philosophy of it throughout Brothers Karamazov. So I'll explain the concept of Sobernost using examples from Brothers Karamazov in 3 ways: religion, community, and the superiority of Russia, or as Tsar Nicholas I pitted, orthodoxy, nationality, and autocracy. The first road to understanding Sobernost is through religion, a topic I've already touched upon a bit. It is not a coincidence that the novel's central actions begin at a church, and a church with a very particular Russian tradition of elders. Elders, also known as starets, are religious figures recognized by the people as a venerated teacher and advisor. They seem to be imbued with mystical talents, such as being aware of a person's secrets even if that person is a stranger to the elder. They are also able to heal and prophesy through their devotion to suffering, prayer, and contemplation. The Optina Monastery is said to be the origin of eldership, an important monastery in Dostoevsky's personal life, which is said to actually be the model upon which Zosima's monastery is built upon. It sets the tone for the rest of the novel as it delves into questions of religious morality with a Russian Orthodox perspective. Western readers may question why a novel about parricide begins in a monastery and opens with questions about eldership and the supremacy of the Orthodox Church, but understanding the importance of religion in the Russian identity is key to understanding the rest of the novel. As I alluded to before, while the Western Church was influenced by logic and individualism, the Eastern Church took a different approach. Whereas the Western Church used logic to argue both for and against the existence of God, the Eastern Church sat firmly on the position that God was beyond logic, and therefore logic could neither explain its existence or its non-existence. For the Eastern Orthodox Church, God is personable and unknowable. This means that you can only know God through personal experience, and since God is outside of the known, that what we know as humans cannot explain God. We see this in Brothers Karamazov in a conversation with Ivan and Alexei. For me, it's on page 276 to 277. So Ivan says, "I love those sticky little leaves in the spring and the blue sky. That's what. You don't love those things with reason, with logic. You love them with your innards, with your belly." Alexei responds, "I've always thought that, before anything else, people should learn to love life in this world." And Ivan says, "To love life more than the meaning of life?" And Aloysia says, "Yes, that's right. That's the way it should be. Love should come before logic. Just as you said, only then man will be able to understand the meaning of life." Ivan and Alexei are talking about philosophy, and this discussion leads into the Grand Inquisitor. If love and God precede logic, or better yet to say, preclude logic, then we can see how Dostoevsky intended for a simple kiss from Aloysia to disprove Ivan's argument. The kiss, as a reply, represents an overriding act of love and forgiveness. It doesn't counter Ivan's logic in like, but logic cannot counter the kiss. Love comes before reason. Another interesting aspect of religion in Brothers Karamazov that can help us understand the idea of Sobernost better is the idea of suffering. They draw from different sections in the Bible to elevate suffering as a path to salvation. I'm not here to argue the legitimacy of this claim, just to showcase it as an aspect of the Russian Orthodox Church at the time of Dostoevsky's writing of Brothers Karamazov. In general, they believed that we have to be like Jesus to reach salvation, and in that they did not seem to mean just to be kind and love one another, but also to suffer like Jesus suffered. We see this as a theme throughout Paul's letters, and especially in Romans chapter 8, verse 17. "Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs of Christ, if indeed we share in the sufferings in order that we may share in his glory." We also see this notion of suffering as good, as cleansing in Brothers Karamazov. For example, Dimitri's defense lawyer surmises that the jury should show mercy to Dimitri. And the result of that mercy will be suffering. He says, "Inflict upon him the worst punishment imaginable, but a punishment that will save his soul and regenerate him." Dimitri himself also believes that he deserves to suffer, not because he is guilty of murder, but because he needs redemption. And for a Russian in the 19th century, that redemption can only be religious. He says, "I want to suffer and to cleanse myself by suffering." It is also important to note that Dimitri accepts this punishment, this suffering, after having this dream about the Russian people. He believes that his suffering will help him become more Russian and capable of offering salvation to the Russian people, similar to how Jesus had to suffer to offer salvation for humanity. And as I established in a previous video, Dostoevsky is very aware of the depth and intensity of suffering Dimitri is going to experience in a labor camp in Siberia. Part of Dostoevsky's idolization of Russia and the Russian identity, which I call here Sobernost, is the supremacy of the Orthodox Church. Very early on, we get a discussion of the importance of the church, and while the most obvious argument of Ivan's that the church should take over the state and criminals should be charged in ecclesiastical courts, there's also this other idea present. Father Passai says, "To become the universal church, it is the great mission and destination of the Orthodox Church on earth. The star will rise in the east." The star will rise in the east is a reference to how the Magi were able to find the infant Christ in the Bible, but here Dostoevsky is elevating the Russian Orthodox Church as the star that all will eventually follow to find the true Christian church. Throughout Brothers Karamazov, we can see how religion permeates everything. Every character has something to say about religion or God. Even Ivan, the most Western of the brothers, is preoccupied with God. Aloysia is steeped in the very Russian tradition of elders. Dimitri, too, eventually comes to religion at the acceptance of his suffering. There are whole sections dedicated to religious figures, religious questions, and arguably the whole novel is a moral philosophy. As Western readers, with our biases towards logic and atheism, we may be missing out on key moments and ideas in Brothers Karamazov, or even just be confused as why Dostoevsky comes to some of the conclusions he does. A better understanding of orthodoxy and Sobernost can help us better understand this great Russian novel. While I'm breaking down Sobernost into these different elements, an important aspect of this Russian identity is that these things are not inseparable. We see that in Brothers Karamazov when religion is linked to community. In Zosima's teachings, for example, he writes, "He who does not believe in God will not believe in God's people either. Only the masses of simple, humble people and their growing spiritual power will be able to convert the atheists who have been uprooted from our native soil. A nation is lost without the word of God." And I have established in my video on Dostoevsky that he believed that Russians were the messianic nation. In other words, God's people. So let's then move on to how community is an aspect of Sobernost. The idea of Sobernost originated as a religious term, but it was eventually used by Slavophiles, especially Alexei Khomyakov, to form a social ideal as well. The Sobernost ideal was about love, freedom, and truth of believers, Orthodox believers to be clear. We can see this throughout Brothers Karamazov, as the hero, Aloysia, and his role model, Zosima, both hold these ideals of love, freedom, and truth to be the highest morals one can hold. If we look back with this lens at Ivan's arguments in the Grand Inquisitor that people are more happy with less freedom, we can see even more the power of Aloysia's kiss. It is important to Aloysia that one has the freedom to choose to believe in Christ, and this was an idea rooted in Sobernost. We also have Aloysia repeatedly described as loving all of mankind, and one of the general philosophical inquiries is whether we are capable of loving mankind without a belief in God. The consensus Dostoevsky would have come to is that we cannot, but do Western readers with a steeper history of atheism and individualism come to a different conclusion? The love that Dostoevsky argues for is an active love, a love that requires action. Aloysia's character is a great demonstration of this. His love is definitely not passive. He is told by his role model Zosima that he must lead the monastery, an arguably passive place. You know, one of the traditions of the elders was solitude and hesychasm, which was a method of prayer as dictated by Jesus in the Gospels, that if you want to pray, you go into a room and you close the door. So the life that Aloysia was on track for would have been a more passive one, if not for the advice of his elder to go out into the world and practice active love. Aloysia's kiss is not just a kiss, but it holds behind it all the force of active love that Aloysia has demonstrated throughout the novel. As Zosima explains, love is such an infinite treasure. It can buy the whole world and can redeem not only your sins, but the sins of all people. It is Ivan who is passive in sitting and thinking about and in terms of westernization instead of embracing Russia actively. We see this further with Dimitri, who refuses to escape his punishment because it would mean leaving Russia and its people. He says, "I managed to get as far away as America. What cheers me is the thought that what I'd find there would not be joy and happiness, but something that might be even worse than hard labor in Siberia. Yes, worse, Alexei, believe me. I know what I'm saying. That America, god damn it, I hate it already. Even if Grusha is with me, for look at her. What kind of an American woman is she? Every little bone in her body is Russian. I still say to hell with them. They aren't my kind of people, and I don't want to have anything to do with them. It's Russia I love, Alexei, and I love the Russian god, although I myself am no good." Another way in which the Sobernost ideal of community is shown in Brothers Karamazov is through an examination of serfdom and peasantry. According to Khomyakov, Russian institutions, such as the peasant communes, were an exemplary model for Sobernost. We see throughout Brothers Karamazov this notion that the Russian peasant is the soul of Russia. It is also interesting to note that this again ties back into religion and the notion of suffering. We are constantly told about Russians being beaten or suffering in some manner, and while as a Western reader we do not see that as a good thing, in fact there were revolutions fought about these things in Western Europe, it is not such a bad thing in the Sobernost ideal. We are told that the best way of handling an ordinary Russian is to flog him. He's a scoundrel and there's no need to be sorry for him. Thank God he still gets his birching occasionally. Russia is rich in birch. If the Russian forests were destroyed, it'd be the end of Russia. I'm all for clever people. Now we've stopped flogging them. Our peasants who have enough sense have started flogging themselves. The perfect Sobernost community could be based upon Russian peasant communes. I'm not going to get into the big political aspects of these communes and the later communist revolutions, but know that these actions are simmering in the background of Russia at the time that Dostoevsky is writing. The strongest aspect of these communes was to uphold social norm and order. Individuals were less important than the community as a whole. It was the understanding of peasants that the rules and punishments if you didn't follow those rules of these communes were there to protect them. This notion of the community over the individual is important to Sobernost. The idea is that one conforms to the truth as opposed to the truth being individual to each person. This is another alien idea to Western readers, steeped in a tradition of individualism. We tend to think of ourselves as separate from other people. We may belong to different communities, but we can have different ideas from those proposed by the community. In Brothers Karamazov, we see this criticism of individualism from the prosecutor, who says about Fyodor Karamazov that he is just the opposite of what a citizen should be. It is total isolation. I would even say a deliberately hostile isolation from society, an attitude that may be summed up this: let the rest of the world go up in flames as long as I am fine. Dimitri and his father were quite similar in their individual pursuits of money and women, the same money and women actually, but while Fyodor's actions led to his death, Dimitri is redeemed. Dimitri's redemption is in turning away from the individual goals and towards a greater love of Russia, an acceptance of being Russian. Dostoevsky has him realize that every one of us is responsible for everyone else. We bear the guilt for all the babes because we are all children. Small or grown up, we are all babes. All go and suffer for all of them because someone, after all, has to pay for all the others. If you've seen my other video on Dostoevsky's personal life infiltrating the story of Brothers Karamazov, you remember that he was involved in groups that discussed the abolition of serfdom. At the time, this was not actually a radical idea. The emperor himself was contemplating the abolition, and it actually came to fruition in 1861 with the Emancipation Reform. We know that Dostoevsky was in support of this, and we can see that in Brothers Karamazov too. The demon that appears before Ivan is described as a landowner who prospered under serfdom and who, after the recent abolition of serfdom, had little by little become impoverished and had turned into a well-bred parasite. Not a very complimentary portrayal of serf owners, if you ask me. Alas, while Dostoevsky may have agreed with the reform that abolished serfdom, there were some other reforms that he felt may have undermined Sobernost. A good chunk of Brothers Karamazov actually deals with the court case of Dimitri, featuring impassioned speeches and amateur psychology. The important reforms in regards to the criminal court is the fact that Dimitri is now going to be tried by a jury, comprised of 4 government officials, 2 merchants, and 6 artisans or laborers. Prior to 1864, Russian courts allowed semi-literate judges to administer justice in a tribunal which was heavily overexerted and under-officiated. The judicial reforms borrowed a lot from Western Europe and brought in trial by jury. A lot of other changes naturally followed, and the criminal court became a theater for political debate and the social advancement of lawyers. And we can definitely see that happening in Brothers Karamazov, as the prosecutor almost faints after delivering an intense and stirring speech. As modern Western readers, this would be a familiar courtroom scene, but Dostoevsky felt it was too Western, and if we take a closer look, we can see how he undermines the new reforms. It is this new reformed court system that finds Dimitri guilty and sentences him to this horrible punishment. It is significant that the title of this chapter is A Miscarriage of Justice. Dostoevsky was not a fan of the new legal reforms in Russia at this time. We also have Ivan's demon commenting on reforms going on in hell. He says, "This of course is a result of adopting reforms when the ground is unprepared, especially when the reforms are copied from abroad and alien institutions are transplanted. Nothing but harm can result from such reforms. The good old hellfire was much better." While this message is coming from a demon, and we are inclined not to side with him, it is important to note that Dostoevsky used Brothers Karamazov as a battleground for challenging his own ideas. We see that almost every idea he presents in this work has a counter-argument to it, but ultimately it is the miscarriage of justice on behalf of Dimitri, who we as readers know is innocent, that betrays Dostoevsky's true feelings of the reform. The last element of Sobernost I'd like to address in this section is that of the superiority of Russia and autocracy, which is the rule of one person with absolute power. Komyakov, one of the founders of the Slavophile movement, which encapsulates the Sobernost movement, was convinced that Russia was not intended for its own national prosperity, but for the salvation of the world. Slavophiles, of which Dostoevsky was one, obviously, believed that Russia held the secret of freedom. This not so well-kept secret was to absolve the common people of the political. The role of the autocratic Tsar was to take on the burden of power so that the Russian people can concentrate on being free and Russian. They believe in the separation of the state and the individual. The argument was that Russian people had no desire for political power, that they were more concerned with inner moral or spiritual perfection and growth. The Tsar was like a father figure that protects the people from external problems or politics. We can see this in Brothers Karamazov, as the primary focus is on the different internal, spiritual, and moral problems the brothers face. The talk focuses mostly on religious, personal responsibility, philosophy. The only person we see concerned with external politics is Ivan. But even his concern is with the role of the church in the state and vice versa, so still really more of a spiritual concern. The other issue is people grumbling about reforms, and that is because suddenly the common people are forced to focus outside of themselves. For example, in the justice reforms that introduced the trial by jury. Or the abolition of serfdom, which is praised by Dostoevsky. It seems a little contradictory that he welcomes one reform and balks at the others, but the abolition of serfdom is actually fitting with the notion of Sobernost, as conservative Slavophiles like Dostoevsky believed in the concept of pokvenechestvo. Pokvenechestvo was the belief that Russians should return to the soil, to the ways of peasants, which was seen as the authentic Russian character. There's a section in the beginning of Brothers Karamazov where Dostoevsky laments on the mistreatment of peasants, and in particular peasant women, in regard to giving birth and having to work the land. He writes, "There is among peasants a dumb and long-suffering grief. Accordingly, the solution is not political reform to help peasants or women, maybe introduce maternity leave or increase wages or introduce healthcare, but the solution is instead spiritual. They only have to repent and believe in God's love to be cured of grief and understand that suffering is a part of the Russian identity, as I discussed earlier." This belief that Russia was a messianic state sent to free and protect the world is also seen in Brothers Karamazov. I discussed this in a video where Dostoevsky is found in Brothers Karamazov and how this led to horrible anti-Semitism and a strange unchallenged passage in Brothers Karamazov about Jewish people eating Christian children. Dostoevsky believed in order to prove the messianic nature of Russia that he had to disprove that the Jewish people were God's chosen people. That role now belonged to Russia. We can see other ways in which Brothers Karamazov embodied the Sobernost ideal of the superiority of Russia when we look at the Slavic world at the time. The Pan-Slavic movement gained momentum after military actions like the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. So it occurred while Dostoevsky was writing Brothers Karamazov. Russia was fighting to free Balkan slaves from Ottoman rule and to bring them under the rule of the Russian Tsar. Russia saw itself as the leader of the Slavic world and wished to protect it from non-Slavic and particularly Western rule and influence. They even went so far as to call Ukrainians Little Russians and Belarusians White Russians, not the drink, and tried to suppress their language and culture and make them become more Russian. This became a particular problem in regards to Poland, though. While Ukraine and Belarus were Orthodox, Poland was largely Roman Catholic, a Western religion with a history in rationalism, so the complete opposite of the mystical Slavic Orthodox Church. I'm not going to go into a whole history on Polish-Russian relations because it's complicated, but suffice it to say that the Tsar often used anti-Russian rhetoric in order to unite the Russian people. In Brothers Karamazov, we see that. We have some Polish characters who are not very well portrayed at all. Grushenka's former fiancé, Pan Muslalowicz, is described as rather bloated, almost middle-aged faced, with its short nose and the stringy, dyed, arrogant mustache beneath it. Mitya didn't even particularly object to his very poor quality Siberian-made wig with hair absurdly combed forward by the temples. They cheat at cards, they call Grushenka a slut, and they state wild claims such as Gogol writing about them in Dead Souls. They also at one point toast to Russia within its borders of 1772. Their pride in being Polish is ridiculed by Dostoevsky's portrayal of them as fools. 1772 is significant here because it was the year of the first Polish partition, in which Russia, Prussia, and Austria divided the country between them. So they are saluting a Russia that has not yet annexed Poland. By 1795, the country of Poland was no more, and a large portion was now under the rule of the Tsar, and the Russification of Poland was being implemented, but not without backlash, because the Polish people were significant participants in the various European revolutions that occurred in the mid-1800s. What is further interesting in Brothers Karamazov is that the Polish officers, after leaving the Russian party, are found living in poverty and hunger after begging Grushenka for a loan of at least 1 ruble. She found them living in dire poverty, almost indigent, without food, heat, or tobacco, and owing money to their landlady. The Poles met her with their usual pompous and aggressive airs of independence. We can argue, knowing a bit about Russian-Polish history and Dostoevsky's pro-Russian sentiments now, that this scene can be seen as a microcosm of the larger geopolitical issue. Dostoevsky shows the Polish people as dependent on Russia's kindness and love for survival, but they're not willing to assimilate to Russian culture, refusing to adapt, which was seen as vital to a Sobernost Slavophilia that Dostoevsky argued for. The Tsar was also seen as protecting the Russian people from the West. Western leadership was seen as the neutral, rational arbiter of law, detached from society, which us as Western readers probably see as a good thing. But for the Russian, that form of leadership was an alienated external force which destroyed organic social bonds and led to discontent and struggles. Russian rule was about unity, community, the idea of pakvenichestvo, and the idealization of peasant communes. We'll skip over the effect this had on oppressing the working class, keeping them impoverished, and leading to the communist revolution only 40 years later. In Brothers Karamazov, there is a strong concentration on Westernization versus Russia, or what I'm calling Sobernost. I think the best way to examine this actually is through a closer look at the brothers. My proposition that each of the Karamazov brothers represents a different aspect of pro-Sobernost or pro-Western beliefs is not actually complete conjecture. Within the text itself, Dostoevsky tells us that, unlike his brothers, one of whom represents the Western and the other the Russian national principle, Dimitri Karamazov represents Russia directly as it is today. I'm going to break this down even further. So while it's obvious that Aloysia is the Russian national principle and Ivan is the Westernizer, I'd like to delve further into that. In this section, I'm going to argue that Aloysia represents the Russian ideal of Tshai, and Dimitri represents the Russian ideal of Grovne, and Ivan challenges both of these ideals as the Westerner. In his Great Courses lectures on the history of Russia, Mark Steinberg argued that Russian czars had to embody both Tshai and Grovne to be ideally Russian. I believe that in Brothers Karamazov, these traits are split between Aloysia and Dimitri, but that both are equally representative of the ideal Russia Dostoevsky pictured. So Tshai is the gentle, pious, saintly Christian side of the monarchy. Aloysia's overwhelmingly descriptive is his love of humanity, largely due to his faith. In the first paragraph of his introductory chapter, we are informed that he is a lover of mankind. His role throughout the book is one of calmness, gentleness, forgiveness. Even when he is bit by a young boy, he remains calm and actually goes on to visit that young boy. His initial decision to become a monk also reflects the Tshai aspect of the ideal Russian character because, as I've already established, the Orthodox Church is an inextractable aspect of Sobernost. The Tshai Tsar is united in love and harmony with his people, and we see this in Aloysia's placement as the hero of Brothers Karamazov. He is the ideal of love and harmony, as he is also the uniter of the two brothers, as I discussed in my video on the id, ego, and superego. It is also interesting to note that Tsar Alexei had the epithet of Tshai. The idea of Grovny can be described as the opposite of Tshai, as Dimitri can be described as almost the opposite of Aloysia. The Russian idea of Grovny is described as awesome and mighty and is linked with military might, power, honor. It is also linked with having a temper and being violent. We know that Dimitri was a member of the Russian military, and we see clearly his violent nature, as he beats his father, Captain Snedigrov, and is believably accused of his father's murder. Dostoevsky also repeatedly remarks about Dimitri's sense of honor. Even both sides of the prosecution and defense recognize Dimitri's sense of honor. So we can see how he best represents the notion of the ideal Russian. These two aspects are seen actually better when they're in conflict with the Western ideal represented by Ivan. So Ivan is presented as rational, educated, worldly. He even longs to visit Western Europe repeatedly. He confronts Aloysia's Russian ideal of love with reason. He cannot understand how it is possible to love one's neighbors. I must admit, Ivan began, I have never been able to understand how it is possible to love one's neighbors. And the notion of harmony among people, through acceptance of Russian culture and rule, of course, he says, I have no wish to be part of their eternal harmony. But we are only ever confronted with Ivan's thoughts. It is Aloysia's actions that counter Ivan's strive for westernization. Ivan doesn't believe in love for humanity because he can't come to that logically. Aloysia, however, does, and it is not his beliefs, but his actions that prove this. Aloysia embodies the Sobernost notion of active love. It is through his actions toward the young Aloysia, embracing and supporting him even after he has hurt Aloysia, that makes Aloysia kissing Ivan even all the more powerful. It is a form of active love that disproves a logical belief. We also see how Ivan's westernization comes into conflict with Dimitri's Grovny. Dostoevsky tells us straight up that there is such a remarkable contrast in character and personality that it is hard to imagine two men more alike when he writes about Ivan and Dimitri. The brothers have an interesting relationship, as Dimitri is said to respect his brother, to respect his education and intelligence. Dostoevsky writes, he showed tremendous respect for Ivan and spoke of him with strange emotion. He had an enthusiastic admiration of Ivan. So it seems that Grovny can look at the westernizer and respect it, but not want it for itself. Conversely, we are told that Ivan never really liked his brother Dimitri. It may be useful at this point to say a few words about Ivan's own feeling for his brother Dimitri. Ivan had never liked him. Even when he felt sorry for him, the feeling of pity was always mixed with a contempt, which at times bordered on outright revulsion. Dimitri's whole personality and even his appearance made Ivan cringe. Dostoevsky is here showing how the West has no respect for Russia and their values. He reaffirms this when Ivan ultimately ends up paying the price for being Western, with a complete mental breakdown when confronted with the consequences of rational Western thought. Smerdyakov, didn't forget about that brother, he represents the ultimate conclusion of Ivan's westernization and Dostoevsky's fear of atheism. If we follow it through to its logical conclusion, according to Dostoevsky and extreme Slavophilia, then murder, and especially the heinous parricide, will be permissible. As Western readers, we may ally ourselves with Ivan, as he represents the ideals that we were raised with. Rationalism, even if you do believe in God, individuality, and education. But through a closer understanding of Dostoevsky's own beliefs and Sobernost, the Russian emphasis on orthodoxy, nationality, and autocracy, we can see how Brothers Karamazov actually argues against these notions, and how a simple kiss can disprove logic. I think it's always a good idea to examine our own biases and the biases of the author to gather a better understanding of our reading. I think that knowing these issues, keeping an open mind, and reading literature can help challenge personal beliefs and help you grow not only as a reader, but especially as a person. I know that I personally learned and grew so much in my close relationship with Brothers Karamazov, and I look forward to diving into this book yet again with all this research to help me better understand it going further. So, до свидания, and thank you for watching.